My husband made me sleep in the garage so his brother could have our bedroom. And honey, I want you to sit down with your tea because this one still makes my hands shake a little when I tell it. I'm Colleen. I'm 70 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened not long ago, just last year in fact, and it changed everything. I thought I knew about the man I married 43 years ago. Gary and I had been married a long time, long enough to know each other's little habits, long enough to finish each other's sentences, long enough that I thought there was nothing left that could surprise me about him. We had a nice house, nothing fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom place we'd worked hard for over the decades. Our bedroom was small, but it was ours, decorated the way I liked it, with the quilt my own. Mother had sewn for us as a wedding, gifts still folded neatly at the foot of the bed. That quilt meant everything to me. Gary's younger brother is named Melvin. Now, Melvin had always been what you might politely call unreliable. He drifted from job to job, from apartment to apartment, always with some excuse, always with someone else to blame for his troubles. Gary, bless him, never could see his brother clearly. To Gary, Melvin was still the little boy he used to protect on the school playground, even though Melvin was now a grown man in his 50s who had simply never learned to take responsibility for his own life. One evening, Gary came home from work looking nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot the way he always did when he had something difficult to say. He told me Melvin had lost his apartment again, something about unpaid rent, and that he needed a place to stay for a little while. Of course I said yes. What kind of person turns away family in need? I told Gary we could set up the spare room, the one we use for sewing and storage, and Melvin could stay there until he got back on his feet. But that's not what happened. 2 days later, I came home from my sister's house to find boxes stacked in our hallway. Not boxes belonging to the spare room, but boxes belonging to our bedroom. My clothes were folded into laundry baskets sitting in the hall. My nightstand had been emptied out, and there in our bedroom, unpacking his own suitcase onto our bed, was Melvin, whistling some tune to himself like he owned the place. I stood in that doorway with my mouth hanging open, and I called for Gary. He came around the corner, looking guilty as a dog that had gotten into the trash, and he told me, calm as you please, that he'd decided Melvin should have our room because the spare room was too small and too cluttered with my sewing things, and that surely I wouldn't mind sleeping somewhere else for a little while since it was only temporary. I asked him where exactly he expected me to sleep, and he told me, without even blinking, that the garage had that old cot from when our son used to camp out there with his friends, and that it would only be for a few weeks. A few weeks in my own home, sleeping on a cot in a garage that smelled of motor oil and old paint cans, while his grown brother slept in my bed, under my mother's quilt, in the room I had decorated with my own hands. I want to tell you, dear, that I fought him on it right then and there, that I stood my ground like a strong woman should. But the truth is more complicated than that. I was tired. I was hurt in a way that went so deep, I couldn't even find the words for it in that moment. And there is something about being married a long time that makes you doubt yourself. When the person you trust most looks you in the eye and tells you that you're overreacting, that you're being difficult, that family comes first, and surely you understand that. So I packed a small bag. I took my pillow and one blanket, and I walked out to that cold garage, and I lay down on a cot that creaked every time I shifted my weight, and I stared up at the exposed rafters and the spider webs in the corners, and I cried myself to sleep, listening to the sound of my husband's brother's television playing through the wall, in the room that used to be mine. That first night, I told myself it was temporary, just like Gary said, but nights turned into a week, and a week turned into 2, and Melvin showed no signs of looking for his own place. In fact, he seemed to be settling in quite comfortably. He rearranged my closet to fit his own clothes. He complained when my perfume bottles were still sitting on what he now called his dresser. He even asked Gary, within my hearing, if I could hurry up and finish clearing out the last of my things, because he wanted to bring more furniture from storage. Every morning I would wake up stiff and sore from that miserable cot, my back aching, something terrible, and I would go inside to make breakfast, and there would be Melvin, sitting at my kitchen table, in his pajamas, eating cereal out of my good bowls, acting as though nothing at all was strange about the situation. And Gary, my Gary, the man who used to bring me flowers, just because it was Tuesday, would sit right there beside him and never say a word in my defense. I tried talking to Gary privately. I sat him down one evening on the back porch, away from Melver's ears, and I told him how much this was hurting me. I told him that a marriage is supposed to be a partnership, that a wife is not supposed to be pushed. Aside from a grown man who refuses to take care of himself, Gary listened, or at least he pretended to listen, and then he told me that I was being selfish, that Melvin had nowhere else to go, that surely I could endure a little discomfort for the sake of family loyalty. He made me feel small. He made me feel like the villain in my own home. Weeks stretched into more than a month. My body grew thinner from stress, and I started sleeping poorly, even on the nights I tried to convince myself the garage wasn't so bad. I began to notice small things disappearing or being moved. My late mother's china, the set I only brought out for holidays, had been shoved to the back of a cabinet to make room for Melvin's mismatched dishes he'd brought from his old apartment. My reading chair, the one by the window where I liked to sit with my morning coffee, had been turned to face the television because Melvin said the light bothered his eyes when he watched his shows. It felt like I was being erased from my own life, piece by piece, and my husband was standing by and letting it happen, all in the name of protecting his little brother who had never once, not in 40 years, learned to stand on his own 2 feet. Now, dear, I am not a woman who believes in petty revenge for its own sake, but there comes a point where a person has to stop being quiet and start being honest, even if the truth is uncomfortable. And the truth came out in a way I never expected. One afternoon, while I was in the garage folding my few belongings, trying to find a way to make that cot feel a little more like a bed, I overheard Melvin on the phone with someone. He didn't know I was close enough to hear through the thin garage door. He was laughing, telling whoever was on the other end that he'd found himself quite a good deal. Free rent, home-cooked meals, and a big brother too soft to ever kick him out, he said, and I remembered these words exactly because they cut through me like a blade, that Gary would let him stay as long as he wanted because Gary still felt guilty for something that happened when they were boys, and Melvin knew exactly how to use that guilt to his advantage. My hands went cold holding that basket of folded laundry. All this time, I thought Gary's blindness toward his brother was simple family loyalty, simple love. But what I was hearing now was something else entirely. Melvin was manipulating him, playing on old wounds from their childhood, using guilt like a tool to secure himself a comfortable life at my expense, at our expense, while I slept on a broken cot surrounded by garden tools and old paint cans. I did not confront Melvin right then. I have learned in 70 years of living that the smartest move is rarely the loudest one. Instead, I waited until Gary came home from work that evening, and I asked him, calm as still water, to sit with me at the kitchen table, just the 2 of us, before dinner. I told Gary what I had heard, word for word. I watched his face change as I spoke, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched 40 years of blind loyalty to his brother crumble and reel. time, as he realized he had been played like a fool, and worse, that he had let his own wife suffer for it. Gary did not say much that night. He sat very still for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the table, and then he stood up, walked down the hallway, and knocked on the door of what used to be our bedroom. I did not follow him, but I could hear the conversation through the walls. Voices rising, Melvin trying to twist the story, trying to deny what he'd said, and Gary, for the first time in longer than I could remember, refusing to back down. By the end of that week, Melvin had packed his things and left, this time to stay with a cousin 2 towns over, though I imagine that arrangement did not last either, knowing him the way I do now. And Gary, my Gary, came to me one evening with tears in his eyes, something I had only seen a handful of times in over 4 decades of marriage, and he apologized. Chilly apologized, not the kind of apology meant to smooth things over quickly, but the kind that comes from a place of real understanding. He told me he had spent his whole life trying to make up for something that happened when they were young boys, an accident that was never even his fault, but that Melvin had used against him for years to guilt him into favors, money, and now, apparently, my own bedroom. Gary said he was ashamed of how easily he had let it happen again, and more ashamed that he had let me pay the price for his blindness. We moved my things back into our bedroom that same weekend. I remember laying my mother's quilt back over our bed and feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for over a month. Gary helped me carry every box, every basket, and he thanked me more times than I could count for being patient with him. Though, truthfully, patient is a generous word for what I had been. Exhausted and hurt would be more accurate. Now, some of you listening might expect me to tell you I never spoke to Melvin again, that I held on to anger for the rest of my days. But that's not who I am, and it's not what this story is really about. A few months later, Melvin called the house, humbled in a way I had never heard from him before, and he apologized too, awkwardly, the way people do when they're not used to admitting fault. I forgave him, because holding on to bitterness does nothing but poison the person carrying it. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and it certainly did not mean opening my door to him the same way again. Gary and I set boundaries after that. Real boundaries. The kind that protect a marriage, instead of quietly eroding it. What I learned from all of this, dear, sitting here now, in my own bedroom, with my own quilt and my own chair by the window, is that love is not supposed to mean disappearing. A marriage is supposed to be 2 people standing together, not one person sacrificed for the comfort of someone else's guilt. I loved Gary enough to be patient, but patience without honesty nearly cost me my own sense of self. It took hearing the truth plainly, and Gary finally seeing it too, for things to be made right again. If you are ever asked to shrink yourself down, to sleep in the metaphorical garage of your own life so someone else can be comfortable, I hope you remember old Colleen telling you this story, and I hope you find your voice a little sooner than I found mine. Now, my dears, before you go, I would love to know where in the world you are watching from. Grandma always loves hearing from her family all over, so go ahead and comment your city down below. I read every single one of them with my coffee in the morning. And if you love your grandma, if this story touched your heart even a little bit, please like this video, subscribe so you never miss one of my stories, and share it with a friend who might need to hear it too. Until next time, take care of each other, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.